Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unraveling what has to be one of the most fascinating and honestly one of the most frustrating biological mysteries of modern life. Think about it. We live in this incredible era where we can track, measure, and optimize literally every physiological metric imaginable. We've got smart rings, wristbands, apps crunching our data 24/7. Yet, we're facing this ultimate irony. Our modern, effort-based, highly engineered approach to sleep is biologically destroying our ability to actually rest. I mean, we are quite literally losing sleep over the idea of losing sleep.
Okay, let's dive into this. The central paradox we're looking at today is that sleep is fundamentally a completely passive biological process. It simply cannot be forced. From an evolutionary standpoint, sleep is a state of total vulnerability. So to even enter it, your nervous system has to perceive absolute safety. When you turn sleep into an active, goal-oriented task, your brain doesn't look at that and say, oh, time to relax. No, it registers it as a problem to be solved, a stressor, a threat. And as you'll see, the very second you try to control sleep, you trigger this massive cascade of neurobiological alarms that literally guarantees you'll stay awake.
And that brings us to a distinctly modern clinical phenomenon. It's called orthosomnia. Sleep researchers coined this term back in 2017 to describe this intense obsession with achieving a perfect sleep score, which is, of course, largely driven by our consumer sleep tracking tech. We've basically taken a completely natural, involuntary bodily function, like digestion or breathing, and turned it into a performance metric. By over-technologizing sleep, we become hyper-fixated on the data instead of just listening to our body's own natural cues. Instead of actually feeling relaxed at bedtime, you feel this intense pressure to perform, and that triggers an anxiety cycle that creates the exact insomnia the device was supposed to cure in the first place. To put that into perspective, recent cross-sectional studies estimate that orthosomnia currently affects anywhere from 3 to 14% of the entire adult population. But here's what's truly alarming. Researchers found that the folks identified with orthosomnia actually have worse insomnia scores than those without it. The anxiety and the poor sleep, they just travel together. When you start trusting an app's algorithm over your own subjective feeling of restfulness, your brain gets locked into the state of anticipatory anxiety. It's literally just waiting to fail the nightly test. To really understand why this happens, we have to go back to the first principles of sleep architecture. In a healthy, completely undisturbed state, sleep is an involuntary transition governed by two main forces. First, we have process S. This is your homeostatic sleep drive, basically the natural, progressive buildup of physical and mental fatigue over the course of your day. Second is process C. That's your circadian pacemaker, the internal biological clock that's deeply regulated by light and temperature. Now, in a normal sleeper, these two forces interact seamlessly. When your environmental and internal conditions are met, the subcortical regulatory centers of your brain just allow sleep to unfold. Zero conscious intervention required. Section 1. The neurobiology of hyperarousal. So what is actually happening at a cellular and neurological level when we try to override this beautifully automatic system? Well, clinical psychologist Colin Espy mapped out how we actively destroy sleep automaticity through what he calls the AIE pathway: attention, intention, and effort. Look, in a normal sleeper, zero conscious effort is applied to sleeping, but the insomnia-prone person completely reverses this. It starts with selective attention. The brain goes into this hyper-vigilant scanning mode, constantly checking the clock, monitoring heart rate. Next is explicit intention, where sleep suddenly becomes a conscious goal, creating rigid rules and all that mental math about how many hours are left before the alarm goes off. And finally, direct effort. You literally try to apply physical and mental force to induce sleep, and that effectively switches your brain from an automatic physiological process straight into manual override. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how this effort actually cross-wires the large-scale networks in your brain. Typically, when you lie down in the dark, no phone, no stimuli, your brain's default mode network, or DMN, takes over. That network effortlessly handles mind-wandering, daydreaming, self-referential thoughts. But in chronic insomnia, this DMN becomes hyperactive and intensely connected to the salience network. And the salience network? That is your brain's threat detection system. Because you're trying so incredibly hard to sleep, any normal bedtime sensation, or honestly just the realization that you're still awake, is suddenly perceived by the brain as a literal, urgent threat to your survival. And when your brain's central executive network locks onto this perceived threat of wakefulness, it sets off a catastrophic physiological feedback loop. Your body's primary stress response system, the HPA axis, fires up. This violently floods your body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Your autonomic nervous system shifts right into a sympathetic fight-or-flight state. So your heart rate elevates, your muscles tense up, and your core body temperature actually rises. But remember our first principles. Sleep biologically requires a lowering of metabolic activity and temperature. So by trying to sleep, you're biologically signaling to your body that it needs to prepare for battle. It's completely counterproductive. This hyper-aroused state also completely warps our perception of reality, creating this absolutely fascinating phenomenon called sleep state misperception. See, your perception of time is closely tied to how much information your brain is processing. Because an anxious, hyper-aroused brain is ripping through an incredibly high density of worry-related thoughts every single minute, the time you spend awake in bed feels vastly longer than it actually is. It's a neurological illusion. Patients will genuinely swear they only slept for 2 hours, but objective polysomnography shows they actually slept for 6. And this misperception fuels daytime worry, which, you guessed it, just fuels the next night's hyperarousal. And this brilliantly illustrates that massive gap between perception and reality. This calculation is absolutely crucial in sleep medicine. It's called sleep efficiency. Sleep efficiency is simply the ratio of your total sleep time divided by your total time in bed. When we panic about not sleeping, our immediate logical instinct is to just spend more time in bed, right? We're hoping to catch a few extra minutes of rest. But as the math reveals, expanding your time in bed usually just dilutes your actual sleep time. You end up with a fractured, low-efficiency sleep architecture. You're just maximizing the time spent in frustrated wakefulness, which neurologically reinforces the bed as a zone of anxiety rather than a sanctuary for rest. Section 2. The physiology of surrender. So if effort and hyperarousal are the real drivers of insomnia, how do we flip the script? Well, we have to shift our entire focus from forcing sleep to regulating our biology. And the biological antidote to the fight or flight response is your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in your body. It deeply connects your brain to your heart, your lungs, your digestive tract. It acts as your body's built-in biological brake. When you stimulate the vagus nerve, it releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which instantly slows the heart rate and drops your blood pressure. Crucially, it halts the HPA axis, totally stopping that cortisol release, and dramatically increases your heart rate variability. This massive biological cascade physically forces your autonomic nervous system out of sympathetic dominance and back into a parasympathetic rest and digest state. But here's the catch. You can't just think your way into vagal stimulation. You have to use a mechanical, somatic lever, and the most effective one we have is diaphragmatic breathing. By placing one hand on your chest and one on your abdomen, you can actually ensure your diaphragm is pulling air deep into the bases of your lungs. The protocol itself is simple but profoundly powerful. Exhale fully, take a slow, deep breath in through the nose, and hold it for a count of up to 7. By slowing your breathing down to roughly 6 breaths per minute, you completely bypass the anxious brain. You send a direct mechanical signal of physiological safety straight to the nervous system, allowing for the cortical deactivation that is strictly necessary for sleep. Section 3. Reframing the sleep mindset. Now, while vagal downregulation calms the physical body, we absolutely have to address the cognitive struggle happening in the mind if we want to fully restore biological automaticity. Historically, the gold standard treatment here has been cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. That relies heavily on rigid sleep windows and actively debating or restructuring negative thoughts. But for a lot of people, this act of challenging, it just creates more mental effort. Enter acceptance and commitment therapy for insomnia, ACT-I. ACT-I takes a radically different approach. Instead of trying to fix the symptoms or follow rigid rules, it focuses entirely on psychological flexibility. Through a process called cognitive diffusion, you learn to observe intrusive sleep thoughts, the classic, I'm going to ruin tomorrow, as just harmless, transient mental events, not absolute threats. It is all about dropping the rope in the tug-of-war against wakefulness. So the crucial point is how we actually put this acceptance into practice in the real world. One of the absolute most powerful, scientifically validated tools in this entire framework is called paradoxical intention. It's the ultimate reverse psychology trick. When you get into bed, instead of trying to fall asleep, you keep your eyes open and genuinely, gently try to stay awake. You literally tell yourself, I'm just going to lie here and rest my eyes, but I am going to stay awake for a few more minutes. Because your goal is now staying awake, the task is impossible to fail. Brain imaging actually shows that this simple shift completely removes the performance pressure. It immediately quiets the brain's threat detection networks and allows that parasympathetic nervous system to seamlessly take over. This quote perfectly encapsulates the core scientific truth we've been unpacking today. The harder you try to sleep, the more difficult it is to fall asleep. One proven way to overcome this dilemma is to stop trying. Whether it's through cognitive diffusion, diaphragmatic breathing, or paradoxical intention, biological restoration requires complete behavioral and mental surrender. You can't conquer sleep. You can only invite it by creating the conditions of absolute safety. Which leaves us with a real paradigm-shifting question for our modern, hyper-optimized lives. Are you willing to give up the illusion of control, to take off the tracker, stop the endless mental calculations, and simply allow your magnificent biology to do what it has evolved to do for millions of years? Because the science is abundantly clear on this one. The only way to actually win the battle for sleep is to surrender.